Now, good evening. Alice, can you hear me all right?
I can, Sarah, yeah.
So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of 2021. Thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening. If you have questions as we go through the evening, please do type them in and I'll be delighted to go through them with Alice over the course of the conversation. But now to welcome our guest for this evening. I'm really thrilled to be joined by a long-standing friend of the Little Museum and an incredible woman called Alice Leahy. Alice was the 2018 Irish Red Cross Humanitarian of the Year. Tonight, Alice is going to speak to us about her memoir, The Stars Are Our Only Warmth, which she wrote with Catherine Cleary, another good friend of the museum, and to speak a little bit about the Alice Leahy Trust. Alice, I'm so thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and good evening, everyone.
Sure, please do let us know where everyone's joining us from this evening. Type into the comments, it'd be really lovely to know where everyone is joining us from. But I'm going to just jump into it and ask you the first question and just kick off the evening. Now, Alice, your memoir, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, I guess you begin right back at the beginning talking about your own childhood. I kind of hope you might start there and tell us a little bit about your own childhood and indeed the big house in Tipperary.
Yeah, I grew up in Tipperary, looking out at Slievenamon, the Mountain of the Women. And I grew up on a very big estate owned by Major Jack Hughes and his wife, Olivia. And my grandfather was the steward on that land and my father after him. But you see, I didn't see any difference between the big house and the little house. I really felt every blade of grass was mine and every animal was mine to love and protect. And I really had a wonderful childhood. You know, when I sat back to look at my childhood, I realized how privileged I was. Now, Olivia Hughes was a truly remarkable, wonderful woman, and she treated everyone the same. Now, it was a Protestant family and we were Catholic, but we never discussed religion, but we always got their little green van to go into Mass on a Sunday morning. And we always collected the vegetables and the flowers for the wonderful harvest festival. So I grew up in an environment where for instance, Jack, her husband, when he went fishing to Helvig, I went with him in the van and we got fish and we came home and distributed around the neighbours and we had lovely fresh mackerel. And then he was go to the point-to-point races. And I can still remember going to the point-to-point up in Tullamaine and I would walk down to the first jump as if I owned the horse or as if I was going to jump it. And then we'd come back and my sister would probably be with me and some friends. We'd all put out a rug on the grass and we'd have the flask of tea and the brown bread and the apples from the orchard. So it was really a wonderful place. And I can still smell the vegetables. And we worked there too. I worked every summer, you know, from school, and we picked the vegetables, we picked the fruit. There was no waste of anything. We all helped to make the jam and preserve the eggs and send preserved eggs up to the country shop. I'll tell you about the country shop in a minute because it's a special place. And we used to also pick flowers to send them up to the Adelaide Hospital, would you believe it? And we did, of course, have a train going through Featherton those days. We don't any longer. And then also Olivia Hughes set up, she was a great friend of Dr. Muriel Gahan, who would be known to a lot of people. And they both went to Alexandra College and they used to visit the tenements when there were students there. But anyway, she also set up a branch of Macronatuha in her house. And we had projects, we were budgeting, we were cooking, we were knitting squares to send out to Dominic Peer. He won a Nobel Peace Prize and he was working with the refugees in Belgium after the war. And when I hear people now knitting the squares and I see them on television, because you know, nothing much changes, in fact. So I had a wonderful childhood and I had a project, my project was guinea pigs. And I got a present of a small number of guinea pigs from Jack Hughes. But part of the project was you had to budget, you had to look after the animals, you had to do all the dirty work. And then I had to go into the post office and send a telegram up to Trinity when they would be picked up off the train for research. Now, okay, I might have different views on research at this stage, but it was a wonderful project, and it was all about working, learning the environment, visiting older people in the area with your potted jam or square of brown bread, and watching the postman come with letters from abroad, visiting the then county home to visit people who had no visitors. And then we were involved in environmental projects, like doing looking after the forest, learning about bird song. The more I think of it, the more I realize how special and important it was.
And it's quite beautiful to kind of hear the level of tenacity and kind of full on kind of active project planning, and the tasks that you were taking on from childhood. It's I guess there was probably life skills being established for you at that stage. And because I know when you referenced the country markets there, and I know you came to Dublin as a nurse at the kind of the beginning of your career, and you were telling me recently about the experiences of living in Dublin as a nurse. And then in the book you talk about uniforms, rules, lessons, and what that was like. Like, you might just tell us a little bit about your early work experience and learning.
I suppose coming to Dublin that was in 1960. God, it's a lifetime ago. Where does life go? But age is just a number anyway. But of course, Dublin was very different. Our world was very different. And coming to Dublin was like going to New York now or Dubai. And I remember coming to Dublin and going to Baggot Street. Now, I had applied for nursing in different places, and Baggot Street, in those days, you could go to England. You didn't have to pay a fee, but you had to pay a fee here. And then you had to pay enormous fees to train in the Mater and Vincent's, and you still had to pay a fee in Baggot Street, but that was fine. And but we lived in the nurse's home. Now, nursing then was very different. It was very strict. There was great emphasis on hygiene and courtesy, and also social distancing, because between the beds there was plenty space, and also respect for the dying. Make sure you give time to people and you allow their spirit to move on. And there were tough times too. I mean, a lot of it was a bit like slave labor. I mean, you had to, when you were night duty, you had to carry down the tray down the stairs to night sister with some kind of a meal you had put together. And then, of course, we had the uniform, and they were very strict on uniform. And I must say, to this day, I still admire people who take pride in their uniform, like that their shoes are polished and that. You might consider me old-fashioned, but I still do, because I think it says something about the person who's wearing the uniform. Now, it doesn't mean everyone has to wear a uniform, but it was Baggot Street. It was, my mother had 3 elderly aunts, and they were well on in their 90s when they departed this world. But one of them she was the most beautiful looking woman. I have a photograph of her, but she was a nurse in Daisy Hill, in Newry. So I suppose, and I remember when we would visit her on our bicycles, and she was always reading romantic novels, and she was always smoking and making beautiful apple tarts and telling me about the loves of her life, And so nursing was, it was special really, and I still think nursing is special. There were some wonderful people in the hospital, but we were able to live in, and we had the nurse's home, and there was a laundry and all of that. But 2 things I remember vividly from those days was the nurse's home. And I remember as nurses climbing up the fire station, the fire steps outside, and getting in the window if you could fit in after going out when you shouldn't be out. But incidentally, in 2011, I was nominated by our chairman, Louis Copeland, everyone will probably know Louis, and for Local Heroes Award, and for Santa Rita were sponsoring it. So part of it was, I was shortlisted. Anyway, part of the prize was a night in the Dillon Hotel. Well, it was just wonderful, but it was another world. I mean, we went in, you had the lovely chocolates, and there was 2 bottles of wine, a bottle of champagne, lovely soft towels, soap, things we never would have had in those days. But honestly, I couldn't sleep that night. I felt it was the bedroom I was in probably would have been made up of about 3 of the bedrooms we had to stay in as student nurses, because I remember the window, and I think the ghosts of the past were hovering around that night. But it was great to go back and visit the place. But it was a great time. Nursing was hard, it was strict, but I met a lot of wonderful people there that I met later on in life. But one of the things was connecting. On our free time, we had very little free time, and if you wanted to go out at night, you had to get permission from matron. And I remember once going down to matron to complain about the rashers, because the food in those days, so a few of us, of course, decided we would go and complain, and I was the first up. And when I looked back, there was no one behind me. So I knocked on the door, and matron came out, and she said, what are you doing there now? So I told her, and she said, well, your mother wouldn't agree with this now, and off you go. And it was a wonderful lesson, because I realized if you make a stand, you're likely to be on your own, but as long as you believe in what you're doing, that's fine. So we used free time then, you go to the museum, the art galleries. I used to always go to the country shop. The country shop was my connection with home, because my mother was one of the founder members of the first branch of Country Markets in Feathert in 1947. And it was a cooperative movement, and it was to help particularly the women who didn't have much money and needed to do something. But Olivia, you see, had set up a library in Feathert. She had sent in food on the fair day to people who were there. And as my mother said, we were doing this voluntary, but there was no such thing as voluntary with Olivia, because you just had to do it. But to go into the country shop, it's just down now from where you are in the little museum. It was number 23. I can still see the letters, because my mother was secretary and treasurer. I could still see the letters coming from the country shop to my mother, and then posting them back up to the country shop, because we didn't have technology in those days. And going in there, and you go down the steps, and outside they had a little figure of a little thatched cottage, and every so often that would be stolen by the students going home at night. And sure, that was harmless when you see what's happening these days. But to just go in there, it was beautiful. You know, when you go in the door, you had the rushwork, and we used to do rushwork when we were growing up, and they had the knitting, and they had the foxford rugs, and then you go in and there's small tables with the what do you call it, you know, the oilcloth on the table, and good sturdy cups and mugs, hand painted, and the smell of the scones. Now, there were no fancy dishes like you see now in the hotels. It was plain, solid, nourishing food with none of it wasted. And I used to love going in there.
I think the comfort of a properly made, nice, homely cooked scone, there's nothing nicer in the world.
Well, you have it near you there too, in that lovely restaurant. It's beautiful, and it's awful that these places now are struggling. But the lovely homemade soup there, a good thick bowl of good thick soup, and the lovely homemade brown bread, and none of the glitzy for crockery or that. You know, it's just lovely. So they've recreated in a way the country market.
Yeah, and I think it is. I think we're all counting down the days till when we can safely all reopen and get back to those experiences. But I guess it's kind of fascinating to hear about your training and kind of how you spent the small bit of free time that you had going to museums, kind of, you know, staying in touch and kind of having that relationship with at home through the country shop. But, you know, you then move on to spend a period of time in the Rotunda. And I particularly enjoyed this section. I thought it was such an interesting insight to get. And I wrote down the words, you described the Rotunda as a wonderful place of history and community. You might just kind of refresh me on what that experience was like.
Well, it was an amazing place, the Rotunda, and I felt if I didn't do midwifery, I remember the small group of us who trained as nurses, we said, we're not really proper nurses unless we do midwifery. And I was the only one who did. And I went to the Rotunda. Now, of course, it was very different because you were dealing with all female patients, but you were also dealing with a lot of very poor people, because in Bagot Street, you had people who came from Monaghan and different places, Wicklow, who came up by ambulance to Bagot Street for treatment. And you had a whole mix of people, and you had men and women. But in the Rotunda, of course, it was all women. Now, I loved the antenatal ward. I didn't like the labour ward, but I loved the antenatal ward, so much so that I went back as a staff nurse afterwards and spent a few years there. But you had one big ward, and you had all these women. I can still see the charts, because we didn't have technology, even listening to the baby's heartbeat or that. But the women who were there, many of them were in year after year. And sometimes you'd see the husband coming up the stairs with a bunch of flowers behind his back, hoping nobody would see them. And of course, we used to allow flowers in those days. But I have no doubt when I looked at, when I see the writing, I can still see it on the brown charts with the whole list of pregnancies and maybe people losing their babies and that. But there was still that great sense of joy there when a baby was born. And I remember there was one wonderful doctor there. He was English, Tony Richardson. I think poor Tony died a number of years ago, but he was beautiful looking man. And of course the women were mad about him. So I don't know how many Tonys were born in those days, a bit like when Pope John Paul was there, all the John Pauls we have, but this was, but there was grinding poverty in a way, but you never, and then I got a chance to go out in district a few times, and there was a wonderful midwife there, Biddy Butler, and Biddy was from my own part of the country, but you know, people who have the capacity to help people and to make them feel wanted and that they're doing a great job. And that was Biddy. And you might go into, I remember going down to, you go down in the car, we're going down to Corporation Place, and you needn't worry, the car wouldn't be touched. It would be as safe as could be. But there was a great sense of community in those places, even though there was grinding poverty. And people didn't complain, and they didn't, but I met many of those wonderful people later, but I have no doubt that I listened to some of the people I have met in recent years who are homeless, and not so recent, that I have listened to their heartbeat in their mother's womb. And that was like, you know, when you watch the program, Here's the Midwife, whatever they call it, and they're listening to the heartbeat, and you just think, you know, what lack of opportunities for people and the great opportunities I had. But the wonderful thing about the Rotunda, there were some wonderful doctors and ward sisters there. And there was one ward sister, and I really liked her. She was strict as could be. She was from Connemara. She loved her job. And I think a lot of the nurses gave up their whole life looking after people. And many of them were as institutionalized as some of the religious we hear about. But Mary would often come over in the middle of the night to check everyone was okay. She was very strict, but there was a kindness about her. And looking recently at the President-elect of America nominating his people for jobs, one of them is Walsh, is his name, from Connemara. And I just wonder if there is a connection. I'll be sending him my book anyway to find out. But there was one in the chapel of the Rotunda. There's a beautiful ceiling there. And I often found when I was on night duty there, you would go in and sit for a few minutes and just look at the ceiling with the kind of rays of light coming through the window. And I think now these days, poor nurses don't have the opportunity to do that anymore. But after a while, I began to think, every woman I met going down O'Connell Street, I was looking to say, is that going to be a breech birth? Is that woman in trouble? And I thought, Alice, it's time to go. So I went back to Bagot Street, and I went back as a staff nurse. And then one night, then I got a night sister's post, and I was told I was the youngest night sister in Ireland. I don't know, maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. And I really liked night duty. It was special. You could sit beside a patient and listen to them. You could have a cup of tea with somebody. You could maybe have a chat with a nurse who was having a problem, or a medical student who felt he was going to fail his exams. So you kind of had all of that. But one night I was in night duty, and a woman who was dying called me, and she said, do you mind if I tell you something? So I said no, and I thought she was going to complain or something, and she was very feeble, and she said, you know, you're going to change your life. And she said, you're going to be, first of all, she said, you're going to be asked by a medical student to go to the dress dance with them in the Shelburne. And now there'll be nothing to it, but you go to the dance and you'll enjoy it. And then she said, you're going to be asked by the hospital to do something completely different, and do take it on. And then you're going to meet a widower. Everything she told me happened. So I was asked by the medical board of the hospital, and Keith Shaw, who was a wonderful heart surgeon, he asked me, would I go to the London hospital, because they were thinking of setting up an intensive care unit. So off I went to the London hospital, and that's where Edith Cavell worked. And it was exactly the same as moving into Bagot Street, because it was the wonderful old building, it was in Whitechapel, it was the wonderful uniforms. And then there was a young doctor I'd known from Bagot Street as a student, and he took me to the Royal Albert Hall, and because I think everything I've done in my life, it has been with other people, or other people have enabled me to do it. It's not just about me. And then I came back and set up the intensive care unit with the consultants there. And it was the first intensive care unit of its type in Ireland, and it was on the top floor. It was very challenging. And I can assure you, the problems we were seeing then are still there today. Like, you wouldn't have enough nurses, you would get agency nurses, and you might have a nurse coming in who had very little experience of intensive care, and you're constantly moving things around to make sure that you had sufficient staff. But the one thing I had missed out in all of that, and they had it in the London hospital, it was the first time ever I saw a gathering of people from all sections of the hospital, the porters, the cleaners, the consultants, the nurses, the matrons, sitting down and discussing things. And one of the people there one night who organised all of that was Dame Cecily Saunders, who was involved in getting the hospice movement going. And I have never before or since, in a healthcare setting where it's needed most of all, seen that type of interagency dialogue. So anyway, then I thought it was time to leave intensive care. And we were only in the very beginning of it, Sarah. I'll never get it all in an hour, so you have to stop me. But I decided to leave.
Yeah.
And shock horror, I said I was leaving. And one of the consultants said he would make an appointment for me to see a psychiatrist. And he meant it, because he thought I was totally mad. And a lot of people would, because I was giving up a permanent pensionable job, but it was the best decision I ever made. And actually, this Christmas, I had a letter from a woman who didn't want to give me her address, who was a nurse in another voluntary hospital. And she rang me to say, or wrote to me to say how brave I was, and she just wished she'd been as brave. Wasn't that? There was a sadness in that, wasn't there?
There's something quite beautiful as well, though. It's I think, kind of looking back now at everything that you've so far achieved, it really, it's very fortunate that you did make the decision that you did, that you had the bravery to do that. In reading your memoir, like around this time when you're kind of stepping out of the permanent pensionable job, as you mentioned the fact that you meet a man called Sean Armstrong, and that he ends up being one of the people who actually leaves a lasting impression on your life and really kind of plays a key role. You might just tell us a little bit about that interaction.
He did. When I was in the Rotunda, I started visiting Benburb Street, and actually it was Father Donal O'Mahony, who was mediator in the Herrick case. He told me about Voluntary Services International. Now, Voluntary Services International was set up in Switzerland, so you visited people's flats. We got a second-hand washing machine. You couldn't do it these days. And we took children up the mountains. You got to know people living in tiny flats, but in very solid flats. And you can still smell the poverty. I mean, there's a difference between poverty in rural Ireland and urban poverty. But one of the people, they used to get people coming over on work camps, and people from Dublin would go on work camps. And again, it was, I could still remember sitting on the floor in people's flats and in different places. Of course, we were going to change the world, and we had all the solutions. But we were full of energy. We had great passion. And there was a great, people weren't afraid to say it as it was. And there was a great connection. But one of the people who came to speak to us one night was Sean Armstrong. And you know, there are people who impress you, meet maybe once in a lifetime, and he was one such person I met. And I remember him, he had a long beard, he was from Belfast, he was a journalist who had worked abroad, and he came back to work with VSI in the north of Ireland, and he was particularly working with young people. And I woke up one morning in my bedsit. Of course, bedsits were allowed then in those days. There was progress moving into one. And I heard he'd been shot. And I just couldn't believe it. I had a terrible reaction, because I was thinking at that time I was moving on to something else. But I just thought, here is a man who was doing so much and so much goodness, and he was radiating goodness and positivity and bringing people with him, and he was shot. And I walked around Dublin that day, And we're back to wearing shawls again, but I remember I was wearing one that day. And I remember walking around just aimlessly, really, and just thinking of this terrible waste of life. So a few of us went to his funeral in St. Anne's Cathedral in the north. And after that service, there were a group of people over from Scotland, and he'd been with them. You see what happened? He came back, he married a Cherokee Indian woman on the Giant's Causeway, and they went on honeymoon to Scotland. And then he came back, and when they opened the door, he was shot. And it was absolutely awful. But the group of people over from Scotland said one of them had a dream that night of a huge tree being felled and all these little shoots coming up around it. And you know, it was a perfect description of my view of that man who I'd only met once. So I think we never know the impact people have on us. But I think also it's a reminder that we all have to be careful that we're positive and hopeful and helping rather than creating a world where everyone is unhappy and complaining.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And you know, kind of over the course of the years since and kind of leading up to where we are today, you know, with the Alice Leahy Trust, you know, you've set up what is described as a non-judgemental, befriending social and health service for people who are homeless. And when you and I started talking about that first a couple of weeks ago, you didn't start talking about homelessness, about technical language. You started talking about the great characters that surrounded you during your life. You might tell me about some characters.
Yeah, I mean, everyone we met, and we couldn't have set up the Alice Leahy Trust, which was set up as trust, without the number of people who have been involved. And there were a number of doctors in particularly, David McGee. David trained then as a psychiatrist and then as a psychotherapist. And he had worked in Simon, I worked in Simon at a different time. But and then Professor James McCormack, without whom I wouldn't be here. He was a wonderful, wonderful, amazing man. But I suppose one of the things when I was in Simon, and then Philip Kennedy, who is a quite controversial neuroscientist and neuroscientist, and he's another title in America, where he's doing very controversial work with people who have locked-in syndrome. And so all of those people helped me. But what was crucial to our work is we didn't all see people as patients or clients or customers. They were people who were sharing our space in Dublin at the time. And some of them are the most wonderful characters. I mean, we talk about characters, but many of them, they were very inspiring. They were very challenging. And I think it also helped us to have much wider discussions around the role of psychiatry, about the role of controlling people, about what do we mean by autonomy, what do we mean by people marching to the beat of their own drum. And of course we all do if we're allowed to and if we're strong enough to. And often you can only do that if you're helped by others. But there were some wonderful people we knew. And over the years, I've met some marvelous people in our work. And maybe thinking during the week where Michael, that man, died in UCD. Now he would have been typical of the kind of person we would see, and maybe kindly or unkindly call them characters, because they are characters. And it was wonderful to see how people responded to his passing, young and old, and UCD allowed him to live there. But the interesting thing, I know I've moved on a bit, but I'm making a connection, Sarah. Do stop me, and your listeners do if I'm rambling too much, because I'm inclined to do that a bit. But anyway, when I saw that man had died, I saw where a young man who was inspired to help him, and every week drew his pension. He didn't want to give his name, and he had started doing that after his father died. But before that, his mother did it, and I knew his mother. And could I just read a tiny little bit about her, because I think that man's death and the inspiration, the man who helped him, the inspiration of his mother, she was typical of the person at the time who understood the characters in our world. So when I wrote in my book, I just wrote, I won't give her name. I said she was a very strong woman. She always wore a cape and she was constantly in a hurry. She was firmly on the side of people nobody else wanted to know. She'd say, why is that man barred, arriving at the door of the Simon shelter with the man in question behind her? Well, he was fighting, someone would say. She'd say, that's not good enough. Did you find out who started the fight? But anyway, on the soup run, she met people who were living in dire circumstances. She said, they'll never come in. And she said, and the Simon workers were puzzled because they wanted to stay outside. She said, it's very simple. These people are out and out people, meaning people who lived outside. They'll never come in, so we'll have to bring the houses to them. And I used to visit Dundrum with her, and we go up armed with woodbines. It's not politically correct to mention cigarettes, but the reality is we did. And we go into the shop and we'd buy bullseyes, they were the hard sweets, and different things, and we'd have a list. And it was the same if we were going to the prison. So the characters met there are so many, but I suppose as I mentioned Johnny, who was born not too far, in fact, from the little museum, and he was a very independent man. And I met him down in Brother Kevin's day centre, and he had a nasal polyp, and that was our way of getting through to him because he would never ask for anything. So we got treatment for that, David McGee and myself, and we got him sorted. So over the years, we got to know him fairly well. And his sister was a nun in London, and she would ring up to know how he was. And we'd sit him down and we'd put him on the phone with a mug of tea, and he'd be grand. And we'd have to tell her the little odd white lie just to let her know he was okay. But anyway, he got ill one night and he was taken out to Blanchardstown Hospital. And the doctors were standing at the end of the bed and they were talking about St. James's, and he heard that. And so he went out to the toilet and he was smoking a cigarette. And of course, the smoke was coming out under the door. And somebody had to say to him, now, come on, Johnny, that's not on. You can't smoke in here. So he just left the hospital in his bare feet and he walked all the way into an early house in the morning down in Smithfield. So we guessed that's where we'd find him. And we went in, and going into an early house, the only time I was ever in an early house, I was hoping nobody would see me. And we went in, it was like going in to almost to a theatre where you had all these little lights sparkling. There were all cigarettes, of course, you could hardly go in through the smoke. And he said, oh, here she comes. And he walked back up with us, and we got him sorted out. We got him into a hostel where he was very comfortable, and then he died. And we asked Glasnevin, rather than put him into a pauper's plot, we wanted to get a little plot under a tree or something. And they're wonderful in the Glasnevin Trust. They have since given us a plot. So he was buried there under, listening to the birds on the tree over him. And then there was another man who used to sleep under a tree facing the Shelburne. You know, when you go in behind, there's this big stone wall and a piece of sculpture. And behind that, there was a tree, and he was sleeping there underneath that. And he was from the country. And it was Sean Maher in Stephen's Green mentioned him to me. So we'd take turns at kind of chatting with him. We were getting nowhere with him. And eventually I started dropping him in a hard-boiled egg, and you're hoping he might eat it and whatever. And then maybe some of the soup runners might find him. And eventually, anyway, we did get him to accept help. And Joe Fernandez, who was a wonderful Indian man, a psychiatrist in Dublin, he actually had a band when he was a younger doctor. He was playing the crystal, I believe. So I said to him afterwards, well, now, Joe, I won't always dance to your tune, but I'm sure I dance to your music in the crystal. Anyway, we eventually got him fixed up, and he was staying in a halfway house for people with mental health problems, and he did have mental health issues. But again, somebody said something one day and he misinterpreted, and he walked out, so we had to go and find him. So I just thought, oh, he'd be over in Stephen's Green. And you know, there were public toilets in Dublin. I mean, we've been fighting for now for years. Everything we're fighting for now that were there in the past, and we got rid of them, sadly. But there at the corner where the Lewis stop is, there was a public toilet there, so I was sure he would have gone in there. But of course, it was the men's section, so I couldn't. So I grabbed this man one day. I'm sure the poor man didn't know what was going to happen. But anyway, he knew he was all right. So I said, look, I'm looking for somebody, and I'm quite sure he's in here. And we could hear him shuffling around inside, and his feet up. So we got him back to our place, and we got him, had a shower, got him fixed up, got him into the Ivy Hostel. They were very good to him, and he lived out his life with content, with a degree of content there. And there used to be two people around in the early days, and talk about entrepreneurs. And by the way, Brodie Sweeney, he's involved with the museum, isn't he? Well, one of the people I used to hear about, and I never met him, but he was on the committee in Simon, was Frank Sweeney. And he was the person to go to if they were looking for something. He always got things done. But I don't know, I went sideways now on that. What was I saying, Sarah? I'm going on for too long. Oh yes, the two men in Simon I said about entrepreneurs, but one of them used to go out at night, and you know, outside the pubs where you have the little squares of glass, sturdy glass, set in iron or steel, and so one of them would go out at night and break them, and the next morning his colleague would go out and say, oh, look at the glass is broken there, I'll fix it for you. So they had all worked out a way of dealing with the world, but in some ways we don't. And there was Louise, who lived in a flat down in Benburb Street. She wasn't homeless, but people down there were worried about her. And I remember one night I took her to the gate. She had a cat, and the cat was a problem for everyone else, including herself, and the poor cat never got out. And we went to the gate, and I wonder why people were looking at us. I didn't have to go too far to know, because all they could get was cat. But we went down to the Coffee Inn, and I remember she was chatting with me, but she wasn't with me. And her eyes were glazed, and she was reliving her past. And she described her parents were Seventh-day Adventists, and her mother got TB. And then she was just telling me this story as if I wasn't there. And she then described meeting this Irishman and running along the station in London to get on the train to come back to Ireland with them. And she then got a job, and there were a number of things. We tried to help her to get things sorted out, and the staff in the council were very good to her. And she started then going down to the Kilkenny Design Centre for coffee, getting the bus down to some place, getting her hair done. You could see great changes in her, but she was a terrible snob. And I remember she came in one day and she said to somebody in our place, because she used to come to us even though she wasn't homeless, but she was in many ways in more need than some of the homeless people we met. And she said to this fellow, and she said, oh, you're wearing jeans. And, she wanted to put him down. But eventually, anyway, the poor woman, she ended up out in St. Mary's, and they were very good to her. And she'd had a woman doing home help who used to go out to visit, and she used to write to me. And she wrote to me one day and she said, I'm in a bed, she said, and they told me it cost €2,000. Can you imagine the waste of money? And then she described her nurse brought her in a little pot of snowdrops. So it was always the little things. And then we had a couple, I think it was meant with all kindness, Darby and Joan, but it was at the time when people didn't realize that, there were relationships, but people were always very kind to Michael and Frank, and they tried to get accommodation together. But of course, there was no question of them getting a room together, which is sad when you look back on it. But it got to the stage that Frank had to go into Simpson's Hospital, and they took him in, and they were very good to him. But Michael wouldn't go because he didn't want to have to give up his pension, but he said he'd visit him every day. But I remember sitting in the back of a taxi, going down in Dartry, and again, it was suddenly as if I wasn't there. And Frank started talking, and he said, oh, I wonder where is she buried? And what it was, his mother had died in a fire in the poorhouse, and he never knew where she was buried. But then again, we were able to get on to Glasnevin Trust, and they found out for us. And Frank then died in comfort. And so they would have been seen as characters. And maybe in a way, that was a kind term to it. And there's lots more, of course. But all these people, there was Eddie with his three dogs, Tina Turner, Jezebel, and Bruno. And everyone knew him. And like that, he was living in squalor because everything he was doing was given to his dogs. And when you see him, and he liked coming into our place. And one of the reasons he liked coming in was Maurice Gourey was one of our directors at the time. He loved chatting with Maurice. And I remember somebody came in one day who had psychiatric training, and they identified him by his label. They said, oh, there's somebody mentioning. And I said, no, that's Eddie. And of course, his dogs, and he'd go up to James's, they were very good to him. And eventually, we had to get him into he got into the hospice, and I went out one day and I said, he got his wonderful words of wisdom, like, what are you doing running around like that? Take it easy. Life is too short. And I went up and I said, no, I'll interview him but I hadn't the heart to, because I thought, as somebody said to me once, people's lifestyle, that's their only possession. And we have no right to intrude unless they want to tell us.
And I think there's such a kind of a fundamental kind of respect and kind of premium towards the best interest of the individual in that point. I see a number of messages coming through. I might just note a couple of them out here. We have Joan from the Lucan and Stuart's book club, who you came into.
Oh, yes.
And she was saying, lovely to see you again. And then I also see my colleague Trevor saying, Alice, it's such a privilege to listen to you this evening. You are a national treasure. Then
thank you, Trevor, and thank you for asking me.
And then I see another Keith saying, you tell your story so well. Well done, and please do keep up the great work. Muriel is saying, an hour is not long enough. I could listen to Alice for hours. And just everyone is delighted to see that you're here.
People are so kind.
It's and Alice, there was a phrase that you said to me last week when you were talking about, the way that homeless services sometimes run, that I just thought really was something I'd love you to just talk about a little bit, in terms of, the homelessness has become a sector within society, and there's certain challenges that in itself presents. And you used the phrase, or you quoted the phrase, why don't you waste time with people? I think it was from the NHS in Africa. I'd love you to tell us a bit more about that idea.
Well, how that title came about, as I mentioned, the late Professor James McCormick, and I hope Biddy, his wife, who's a nurse, might be listening, because I wouldn't be here only for James, because I always knew if I tried to rock the boat or say some of the things that I was saying and not going along with the consensus, James was always there to support me. And I think he would have some wonderful things to say about how we're dealing with the pandemic and all of that. But anyway, he came into me one day with the BMJ and he said, Alice, he said, wait till you see this. And it was an article written by a consultant from the NHS who went over to Africa. And of course, he was going over there to help people. But the Anglican bishop sat him down and said, why don't you people in the West waste time with people instead of talking about budgets and projects? So anytime I'm asked to do something, or occasionally I'm asked maybe to meet a group of students or whatever, I always entitle my lecture, if you like to call it a lecture. Well, you call them lectures, but that's what I say. But when I did a book getting a number of essays from people, Fergus O'Farrell, who was in the Adelaide Hospital Society at the time, and he said, Alice, why don't you put a question mark in the book? Because it's, and I will give you a copy of the book for the museum, for your library. But anyway, the idea is, if you don't give time to people, and recently, again, this Christmas, I had a letter from a woman working in a large voluntary body, and she said she was leaving because she was told you can only spend 15 minutes with people. And it's all about red tape, performance indicators, all of that. Now, I've seen terrible changes over the years. Lots of good things happened, but there are a lot of things that I would have huge concern about. And that's why I think reading about UCD's response to Michael's life and death, I think will encourage people maybe to waste time with people. But anyway, when all the money came on stream, and when we started, there were very few people. There were a lot of very committed people, a lot of wonderful people. And suddenly when all the money came on stream and all the plans that people were getting along with, it was as if they suddenly discovered homelessness. Well, homelessness is there for years. And there were all kinds of people with wonderful titles going around. And there was no humor. There was no real discussion. It would always be about how can we get that person to go in somewhere? It was as if somebody had to change their life to work into a plan a group of people had designed around the table. And if they did that and then they moved on, success, and you might get more money in the grant than if you were able, the more you could move on. So there is a huge waste, I think, of money and bureaucracy. And there's a huge lack of understanding around the human condition, because I think an awful lot of things have changed, but the human condition doesn't change. We all need to be loved, to be wanted, to feel useful, and to be able to do our own thing, and not to be controlled in how we live our lives. And I think people who are homeless really challenge us, because if I notice now, people will ring up and they'll say, well, I have a client here, and they're lucky if I don't answer the phone, because if I answer the phone, I'd say, what do you mean you have a client there? You have a person there. And everything has become so sanitized and unreal. And then people get very disillusioned and they give up because they don't see any progress. But I think we need to spend a lot more time listening to the people, rather than wasting money and rushing out to try and get them to change, to work to a plan. A group of people probably sitting around a computer have designed and have no contact with people. And I think there's a danger too that we're not supporting frontline workers, because that even the jargon around homelessness, all of that has become very sterile. And we need to have a sense of humor, because, we don't have the answers. We're all just human, and we're all capable of making mistakes, but we're also capable of doing wonderful things. So, and I often think the question is more important than the answer. And I think we're confusing homeless now. We're conflating the two. People who are becoming homeless because they can't pay their rent, they couldn't get a mortgage, they were living in overcrowded accommodation and feel they're entitled to get a house. I don't mean that unkindly, but that's the way it's gone. And we are forgetting then about the kind of people I'm mentioning there who traditionally, if that's the right word, were the people who we saw as homeless. Now, those people are still around. And I think our politicians have great difficulty too accepting that, because we all view the world from where we stand. And very often when the debate is taking place around homelessness, it's about getting more money, giving more money, building more houses. And maybe they are losing sight of the complexities and the richness of the human condition. And often it's the deaths of people that challenge us to look at that.
And I think I would dare say that this idea of wasting time with people is something that really each and every one of us could probably bring into every aspect of our lives in a positive way. But one thing that I thought about a lot this week that I kind of would love your view on, in the foreword of your book, which was written by Pat Kenny, he spoke about how he believed all of your efforts were driven by this kindness and this compassion, which I think is very evident to us all. But I would be really curious how you would define a word like kindness, what that means to you.
I think it really is about doing what you can for people. It's another side to me. I can be tough, and you have to be tough. You have to be tough to be kind very often. And sometimes you can overwhelm people with kindness, and that can sometimes prevent their growth. So it's about knowing the balance. I think it's about accepting the person and helping them at whatever level they're at. But that does require too a lot of honesty, and saying to somebody maybe, look, you're able to do a little bit more for yourself. You don't have to be depending on people all the time. And that is about treating people with kindness too, because you're seeing what they're capable of maybe. But I think we're very lucky in our agency now. We don't get any money from the state. We're a bit like Chuck Feeney. And actually Chuck Feeney, years ago, remember he used to give out money to agencies and nobody ever knew where it came from. And I remember we got this donation, nobody could find out where it came from. And it was from Chuck. And I was hoping to meet him, and I never got to meet him. He was in Dublin one day and I was to go and meet him, and it just didn't happen. And I just wish I could, because we were hoping that we could kind of go out of business. But you see, we constantly watch where we're going and what we're doing. We've a wonderful board of directors. They meet every 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. we comply with all the government thing. With you have so many different things now. You have the charity regulator, you have the companies, whatever. You have all of those. And I mean, from day one, our accounts were audited, but we don't get money from the state, and we don't ask people for money. But we experience the most amazing generosity. You have no idea. Every single day, and we have people who contact us about, people who come into us once a week, and we've always say if we're short of something, it just arrives. One day I remember Jeanette works, I have wonderful people working with me. It's not all about me. I have Jeanette and Lisa and Mark and Brendan there with me every day, wonderful people. I must get them to go over to see the museum because they're Dubliners. And so we see the most amazing kindness. And I think sometimes if you're rushing too much, you lose sight of that, and the generosity and goodwill of Irish people. It is quite incredible. We people who from down the country send us up lovely Christmas cakes. We have everything. We get everything we need from the generosity of people. And I suppose when the pandemic hit us, what was so nice, we had to close for a very short time. And thanks to technology, Jeanette was able to do the office work from home. And then one of the men we employed lives in the hostel, actually upstairs. So he went down every day and kept an eye on things. And but when the pandemic came, when so many of our supporters from years back were ringing up to know were we all right, were we safe, there was something wonderful about that. And even now that we are back, ringing up, and they'd say, I hope Alice is staying out, and they reassure, and they say, well, thank God she is. She rings in every morning. But there is that wonderful sense of that we're being cared for by other people, because at the end of the day, and I think that's kindness, how we all help each other. And it could be a total stranger you're meeting who comforts you, or you comfort them, or you help them. And I think there is a need for that debate now. When the pandemic is all over, I think lots of people now are getting opportunities to reflect on their lives and how lucky they are, or maybe terrible sadness in people's lives. But I think out of this, maybe we might have more creative imagination. We might have more. You'll probably be getting lots of things in the little museum as people now discover something. They want you to treasure for them. It reminds me, I have a lovely badge from nursing days, and I don't want it to go out in a skip, so I must drop it into you. But, I think it is that connection with our past and hopefully going on to the future. So I think we're living in strange and wonderful and challenging times.
I think that is that's definitely true to say, but it's interesting though to get your opinion on what direction society may go and the influence that the pandemic may have after it's passed, because I think we have to remember that there will be a day when it is past. It might not feel like now, but there will be. And I don't know, I'd love to know how you view the journey that you're taking in life. Do you see this as a career, a vocation, a calling? What do you identify how you spend your days doing?
I couldn't identify, because each day is different. And I suppose it gives me that energy too. I do believe in people, and that all of us are unique. And I think we've all been given gifts too. And that reminds me of just another little piece. I wrote it down because I keep forgetting it, even though I have it stuck up on the well, I won't find it now. It's a quote from, that wonderful, I lost it, I'm not meant to say it then. It is, if you have the energy of enthusiasm, it means that is your mission in life. And that's from that man, I can never pronounce his surname, Paulo Coelho, is it?
Okay.
Yeah, and it is from one of his books, and I cut it out and put it up beside my desk, because when you still feel energetic about life and living and what you're doing, you feel that's where you're meant to be. And I suppose so many things have happened too in our life. one time I was robbed going out to Kappa Hospital, and there was a woman walking along beside me she was like somebody out of a play in the Abbey carrying a case. She didn't see me at all, even though I was lecturing her and saying, be careful now, because somebody could take your case. And she had a little girl with her who looked obviously a bit troubled. And she took no notice of me, the woman. And the next thing, somebody jumped out from over a gate and put his arm around my neck and grabbed my back and ran. She kept going on as if nothing happened. Now, if I hadn't been there that day, I hate to think of what might have happened to that woman. So I think we shouldn't get too caught up in the bureaucracy, and we should be looking out for the little nuggets of wisdom that come our way every day, or the experiences. But I think it's almost about the mystery of life. None of us asked to be born. That was another thing, poor James, you say. We didn't ask where we were born. We didn't choose our parents. Yeah. And here we are. And to suggest that now to somebody working in the whole homeless area out there now, they would certainly say, well, there's something wrong with that woman. She needs to be locked away.
Well, I see that my colleague Fiona has actually very kindly gone and found the quote that you were mentioning there a moment ago. Meaning may remain hidden nearly all the time, but we always know we are close to our true mission on earth when what we are doing is touched with the energy of enthusiasm.
Enthusiasm, yeah, that's right. And could I mention Catherine Cleary? Catherine is one of our board members, and of course she's a wonderful journalist, but the book would never have happened without Catherine, because I had all of this stuff, I had paper cuttings, I had diaries, and I said, I felt I needed to do the book just to give hope to young people, to say anything is possible, and to let them think, you're not going to change the world just because you've arrived now. And we have to learn from experience, and I don't think we are learning from experience. So the idea was to do it for general readership and to get as much as we could into it. Now, I could never have done it on my own. I'd still be surrounded by papers, I think, or maybe gone altogether. But Catherine, she was great, and we worked on it. And only for Catherine, it wouldn't have seen the light of day. And of course, I have to thank Pat Kenny too, who wrote the foreword, because he is a wonderful broadcaster, and I think the best in our country.
Absolutely. And it's truly it's an absolute pleasure to read. I embraced every single page of it, and it's just between yourself and Catherine, it's such a beautiful piece of writing, and it's, I think you are just such an inspiration. You're just such a wonderful gem to listen to, and this is kind of, I think, to quote one of our guests earlier who said they could sit here for hours. I think I willingly would and could, and I would hope that this will be a continued conversation. Let's put it that way. But I think we're coming to the end of the evening, and I kind of wonder, just as a kind of concluding thought, in writing the memoir, you say that hope was one of the key messages that you wanted to put across. But then to kind of to us as readers, as listeners, as people who are joining you this evening, is there one or two messages, pieces of advice, or kind of final concluding thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I suppose one of the quotes I have in the book too, and it's by an elder, Ella Batt, and the quote was, "Our experience is not just our own property, it must be shared." And I came across that in the paper one day, because I'm an avid reader of papers, and I think she worked with Mary Robinson in the elders group. What I would say to people, look, not to be afraid to do something that's good, and don't get sucked into too much negativity. And no matter what you think, even if you think your idea is useless, don't be afraid, because all our ideas are unique to ourselves. And I think if you want to do something and you believe in it, you will attract the people around you to do it. And if you don't, it's not meant to be. And I think just don't be so busy doing things that you can't see what's happening around you, because you could just miss out on something very important.
I think my one promise to myself I consciously didn't make a resolution for 2021. It didn't feel like the year, but I think over the course of this conversation, I've changed my mind, and I think I'm going to commit to wasting more time with people. I think that's my goal for this year. So for that, I thank you.
And every success to the museum, because the museum is a special place. My husband actually left in his taxi plate there because he was a taxi man, driver 4 or 5 national radio cabs. But when people go into your museum, they might look as if they're wasting time, but they are connecting with the past and a life they lived. And some of the tourists who'll be coming from abroad, it would mean a lot to them. So you waste time with people and don't be afraid to, because that really is, you're an ambassador for our city. And more than ever before, I think we need something tangible to connect the past with where we are now and the future. So long may you live there and keep it up. It's a great place.
Alice, thank you so much. It's honestly been a true pleasure, and I really so sincerely appreciate you being so generous with your time.
Thank you, Sarah.
So,
thank you very much. Thanks, Sarah.
Well, to everyone joining us this evening, thank you all so much. This is the first evening of 120 Stories in 2021. We look forward to continuing with you as the weeks unfold. We're going to be joined by Dr. Rona Mahoney next week, talking about the history of childbirth in Dublin. So we're going to continue our theme slightly from parts of this evening's conversation. But for now, good night from all of us in the Little Museum and on behalf of Santa Rita as well. So Alice, thank you and good evening.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening.